We're back with Donna Tartt's The Little Friend.
Life is filled with glory. Now that I know this love was meant to be.
Yeehaw!
Each kiss tells a story, while my heart reads and sings our melody. I love you. That's what my heart is saying, while every breeze is playing our Cuban love song. I love you for all the joy you brought me, the lovely night you taught me our Cuban love song.
Hello, Robs. What do you got?
Thrill my heart.
What do you got, Brubs?
Kiss will cheer me when we're far apart. Oh, I love you with such a tender passion, and only you can fashion our Cuban love song. One melody will always thrill my heart.
Yes, Brubs, it will. 454. Yeah, Brubs. You motherfuckers. Yeah.
Love song.
Yeehaw! All right, Robs, we're back. Let me open this mauve effing channel. If it would ever load, I could open it. If it could open, bruv. I don't know if it can. Does it want to open for me? Yeah. It's opening. Now we're here, Robs, with... Let me open the page. Page 439 of Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. Come on, chat. So I can read what Ty Boy said. Since I have huge blobs on there. Who's this? This is the Bible. Page 439 of Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. Oh, what would you give in exchange for your soul, sang Farish, as he stabbed at the base of Gum's electric can opener with a screwdriver. Let me get my magical belt. He was in a fine mood. Not so Danny, jangled to the backbone with nerves, horrors, premonitions. He sat on the aluminum steps of his trailer and picked at a bloody hangnail as Farish, amidst a glittering disarray of cylinders and snap rings and gaskets strewn in the packed dust, hummed busily at his work. Like a demented plumber in his brown coverall, he was going methodically through their grandmother's trailer, through the carport, through the sheds, opening fuse boxes and tearing up sections of floor and prying apart with sighs and huffs of triumphs various small appliances that caught his eye on a relentless hunt for cut wires, misplaced parts, and hidden transistor tubes, any subtle evidence of sabotage in the electronic apparatus of the household. Directly, he snapped, throwing an arm out behind him. I said directly, whenever Gum crept up as if she was about to say something. I'll get around to it, okay? But he had not got around to it yet, and the front yard was so scattered with bolts and pipes and plugs and wires and switches and plates and odds and ends of metal debris that it looked as if a bomb had exploded and showered trash for 30 feet. On the dusty ground, 2 tab numbers from a clock radio, 00, white on black, stared up at Danny like a pair of cartoon Google eyes. Farish was grappling and groping with the can opener, dickering and dackering amidst the litter as if nothing at all was on his mind. And though he wasn't exactly looking at Danny, he had a very strange smile on his face. Better to ignore Farish with all his sly hints, his sneaky speed freak games, but all the same, Farish obviously had something on his mind, and it bothered Danny that he didn't know quite what it was. For he suspected that Farish's elaborate counter-spy activity was a display staged for his benefit. He stared at the side of his brother's face. I didn't do anything, he told himself. Just went up there to look at it. Ain't took nothing. But he knows I wanted to take it, and there was something else besides. Somebody had been watching him down in the scrub of sumac and kudzu behind the tower. Something had moved, white flash like a face, a little face. On the scummy, shady clay of the path, the footprints were those of a child, dug deep and switching every which way. And this was creepy enough, but farther on, alongside a dead snake on the trail, he'd found a flimsy little black and white picture of himself, a tiny school picture back from junior high, cut from a yearbook. He picked it up and stared at it, not believing what he saw, and all sorts of old memories and fears from that long ago time rose and mingled with the mottled shadows, the red clay mud and the stench of the dead snake. He'd nearly fainted from the indescribable weirdness of it, of seeing his younger self in a new shirt, smiling up at him from the ground, like the hopeful photographs on muddy new graves in country cemeteries. Shut up, Belle. You're just a placeholder. And it was real. He hadn't imagined it because the picture was now in his wallet, and he'd taken it out to look at it maybe 20 or 30 times in sheer incredulity. Could Farish have left it there as a warning? Gesundheit, Baba. As a warning or a sick joke, something to psych Danny out as he stepped on the toe popper or walked into the fishhook dangling invisibly at eye level. The airiness of it haunted him, around and around, turning his mind in the same useless groove like the doorknob to his bedroom, which turned and turned quite easily without actually opening the door. And the only thing that kept him from taking the school picture out of his wallet and looking at it again right now was Farish standing in front of him. Danny gazed off into space, and as often happened since he'd given up sleeping, was paralyzed by a walking dream, wind blowing on a surface like snow or sand, a blurred figure in the far distance. He'd thought it was her and walked closer and closer until he realized it wasn't. In fact, there was nothing in front of him at all, just empty space. Who was this damn girl? Only the day before, some children's cereal had been sitting out in the middle of Gum's kitchen table, some kind of flakes that Curtis liked in a brightly colored box, and Danny had stopped dead on his way to the bathroom and stared because her face was on the box. Her, pale face, black bowl haircut, leaning over a bowl of cereal that cast a magical glow up into her downturned face, and all around her head, fairies and sparkles. He ran, snatched up the box, and was confused to see that the picture wasn't her at all anymore, but some different child, some child he recognized from television. In the corner of his eye, tiny explosions popped, flashbulbs firing everywhere. And all of a sudden it occurred to him, jolted back into his body, sitting in a sweaty flash on the steps of his trailer again, that when she slipped through, whatever dimension she came from, and into his thoughts. The girl, she was preceded in his mind by something very like an open door and a whirl of something bright blowing through it. Points of light, glittery dust flecks like creatures in a microscope, meth bugs, that would be your scientific explanation, because every itch, every goosebump, every microscopic speck and piece of grit that floated across your tired old eyeballs was like a living insect. Knowing the science of it didn't make it any less real. At the end, bugs crawled on every imaginable surface, long flowing trails that writhed along the grain in the floorboards, bugs on your skin that you couldn't scrub off, though you scrubbed until your skin was raw, bugs in your food, bugs in your lungs, your eyeballs, your very squirming heart. Lately, Farish had begun placing a paper napkin perforated by a drinking straw over his glass of iced tea to keep away the invisible swarms he perpetually swatted from his face and head. And Danny, too, had bugs, except his, thank heavens, weren't burrowing bugs, crawling bugs, maggots, and termites of the soul, but fireflies. Even now, in broad daylight, they flickered at the corner of his vision. Dust flecks, experienced as the electronic pops, twinkled, twinkle everywhere. The chemicals had possessed him. They had the upper hand now. It was chemicals, pure metallic, precise, that boiled up vaporous to the surface and did the thinking and talking and even the seeing now. That's why I'm thinking like a chemist, he thought, and was dazed by the clarity of this simple proposition. He was resting in the snowy fallout of sparks which showered about him at this epiphany when, with a start, he became aware that Farish was talking to him, had been talking to him actually for some time. What, he said with a guilty jump. I said, you do know what that middle D in radar stands for, said Farish. Though he was smiling, his face was stony red and congested with blood. Danny, aghast at this weird challenge, at the horror which had wormed its way so deep into even the most innocuous contact with his own kind, sat up and spasmodically twisted his body away, rooting in his pocket for a cigarette he knew he did not have. Detection, radio detecting and ranging. Farish unscrewed a hollow part from the can opener and held it up to the light and looked through it before he tossed it away. Here you've got one of the most sophisticated surveillance tools available, standard equipment in every law enforcement vehicle, and anybody tells you that the police use it to trap speeders is full of shit. Detection, thought Danny. What was he getting at? Radar was a wartime development, top secret for military. Whoa, watch it, milk. For military purposes, and now every single damn police department in the country uses it to monitor the movements of the American populace in peacetime. All that expense, all that training, you're telling me that's just to know who's going 5 miles over the speed limit? Farish snorted. Bullshit. Was it his imagination, or was Farish giving him an extremely pointed look? He's messing with me, thought Danny. Wants to see what I'll say. The hell of it was. He wanted to tell Farish about the girl, but he couldn't admit he'd been at the tower. What reason did he have to be there? He was tempted to mention the girl anyways, though he knew he shouldn't, no matter how carefully he brought it up. Farish would get suspicious. No, he had to keep his mouth shut. Maybe Farish knew he was planning to steal the drugs, and maybe Danny couldn't quite figure this one out. But just maybe, Farish had something to do with the girl being down there in the first place. Those little short waves echo out, Farish fanned his fingers. Then they ripple back in to report your exact position. It's about supplying information. A test, thought Danny in a quiet fever. That was how Farish went about things. For the past few days, he'd been leaving huge piles of dope and cash unsupervised around the laboratory, which, of course, Danny hadn't touched. But possibly these recent events were part of a more complicated test. Was it just a coincidence that the girl had come to the door of the mission that very night that Farish had insisted on going over there? The night the snakes were set loose? Something fishy about it from the get-go, her showing up at the door, but Farish hadn't actually taken very much notice of her, had he? My point is, said Farish, inhaling heavily through his nostrils as a cascade of mechanical parts from the can opener fell tinkling to the ground. If they're beaming all these waves at us, there has to be somebody at the other end, right? At the top of his mustache, which was wet, clung a rock of amphetamine the size of a pea. All this information is worthless without somebody receiving, somebody schooled, somebody trained, right? Am I right? Am I right? Right, said Danny, after a brief pause, trying hard to hit just the right note, falling a little flat. What was Farish getting at with all this broken record talk about surveillance and spying? Unless he was using it to conceal his true suspicions. Except he doesn't know a thing, thought Danny in a sudden panic. He can't. Farish didn't even drive. Farish cracked his neck and said slyly, Hell, you know it. What? Said Danny. Looking around for a moment, he thought he'd spoken aloud without meaning to. But before he could jump up and protect his innocence, Farish began to pace in a tight circle with his eyes fixed on the ground. This isn't generally known by the American people, the military application of these waves, he said. And I'll tell you what the fuck else. Even the fucking Pentagon don't know what these waves really are. Oh, they can generate them and track them, he laughed, a short, sharp-pitched laugh, but they don't know what the fuck they're made of. I've got to cut this shit out. All I have to do, Danny told himself, horribly aware of a fly which buzzed repetitively at his ear like a tape loop in some endless fucking nightmare. All I have to do is get on the ball, clean up, sleep for a day or two. I can go grab the crank and get out of town while he's still sitting on the ground out here gibbering about radio waves and tearing up toasters with a screwdriver. Electrons damage the brain, said Farish as he said this. He looked keenly at Danny, as if he suspected that Danny disagreed with him on some point. Danny felt faint. It was past time for his hourly bump. Pretty soon, without it, he'd have to crash as his overtaxed heart fluttered, as his blood pressure sank to a thread, half crazy with the fear it would stop altogether, because sleep ceased to be sleep when you never had any. Dammed up, irresistible, it rolled in at the last and crushed you senseless, a high black wall that was more like death. And what are radio waves, said Farish. Farish had been through this and Danny before. Electrons. Exactly, numbnuts. Farish, with a manic Charles Manson glitter, leaned forward and thumped his own skull with surprising violence. Electrons, electrons. The screwdriver glinted. Bang. Danny saw it on a giant movie screen like a cold wind blowing from his future, saw himself lying on his sweaty little bed, knocked out and defenseless and too weak to move. Clock ticking, curtains stirring, then creak went the trailer's padded door ever so slowly. Farish easing quietly to his bedside, butcher knife in his fist. No, he cried, and opened his eyes to see Farish's good eye bearing down on him like a power drill. For a long, bizarre moment, they stared at each other. Then Farish snapped, Look at your hand. What you done to it? Confused, Danny brought both hands up, trembling, before his eyes, and saw that his thumb was covered in blood where he'd been picking at the hangnail. Better look after yourself, brother, Farish said. In the morning, Edie, dressed soberly in navy blue, came by Harriet's house to pick up Harriet's mother so the two of them could go out for breakfast before Edie met the accountant at 10. She'd called to arrange the date 3 days early, and Harriet, after answering the telephone and getting her mother to pick up, had listened to the first part of their conversation before putting down the receiver. Edie had said that there was something personal they needed to talk about, that it was important, and that she didn't want to talk about it over the telephone. Now in the hallway, she refused to sit down and kept glancing at her wristwatch, glancing at the top of the stairs. They'll be through serving breakfast by the time we get there, she said, and recrossed her arms with an impatient little clucking sound. Tick, tick, tick. Her cheeks were pale with powder, and her lips, sharply drawn in a cupid's bow, and the waxy scarlet lipstick that Edie usually saved for church, were less like a lady's lips than the thin, pursed lips of old Sieur d'Iberville in Harriet's Mississippi history book. Her suit, nipped at the waist, with 3/4 length sleeves, was very severe, stylish too in its old-fashioned way. The suit that Libby said made Edie look like Mrs. Simpson, who had married the King of England. Harriet, who was sprawled across the bottom step and glowering at the carpet, raised her head and blurted, "But why can't I go?" "For one," said Edie, looking not at Harriet, but over her head, "your mother and I have something to discuss. I'll be quiet. In private for two," Edie said, turning her chilly, bright gaze quite ferociously on Harriet. "You aren't dressed to go anywhere. Why don't you go upstairs and get in the bathtub?" "If I do, will you bring me back some pancakes?" "Oh, mother," said Charlotte, hurrying down the stairs in an unpressed dress with her hair still damp from the bath. "I'm so sorry. "Oh, that's all right," said Edie, but her voice made it plain that it wasn't all right. Not at all. Out they went, Harriet all in a sulk, watched them drive away through the dusty organdy curtains. Allison was still upstairs asleep. She'd come in late the night before, except for certain mechanical noises, the tick of the clock, the whir of the exhaust fan, and the hum of the hot water heater. The house was as silent as a submarine. On the counter in the kitchen stood a tin of saltine crackers, which had been purchased before Ida's departure and Libby's death. Harriet curled up in Ida's chair and ate a few of them. The chair still smelled like Ida, if she closed her eyes and breathed deep, but it was an elusive scent that vanished if she tried too hard to capture it. Today was the first day that she hadn't waked up crying or wanting to cry since the morning she left for Camp de Selby. But though her eyes were dry and her head was clear, she felt restless. The entire house lay still, as if waiting for something to happen. Harriet ate the rest of her crackers, dusted her hands, and then, climbing on a chair, stood on tiptoe to examine the pistols on the top shelf of the gun cabinet. From among the exotic gambler's pistols, the pearl-handed derringers, the rakish dueling sets, she chose the biggest and ugliest pistol of the lot, a double-action Colt revolver, which was most like the pistols she had seen policemen use on television. She hopped down, closed the cabinet, and placing the gun carefully on the carpet with both hands, it was heavier than it looked, ran to the bookcase in the dining room for the Encyclopedia Britannica. Guns, see firearms. She carried the F volume into the living room and used the revolver to prop it open as she sat cross-legged on the carpet, puzzling over the diagram and text. The technical vocabulary baffled her. After half an hour or so, she went back to the shelf for the dictionary, but that wasn't much help either. Again and again, she returned to the diagram, leaning over it on all fours. Trigger guard, swing out cylinder, but which way did it swing? The gun in the picture didn't match the gun she had in front of her. Crane latch, cylinder crane assembly, ejector rod. Suddenly, something clicked. The cylinder swung out, empty. The first bullets she tried wouldn't go in the holes, and neither would the second ones. But mixed in the same box were some different ones that seemed to slide in all right. Scarcely had she time to begin loading the revolver when she heard the front door open, her mother stepping inside. Quickly, in one broad movement, she pushed everything under Ida's armchair, guns, bullets, encyclopedia and all, and then stood up. "Did you bring me some pancakes?" she called. No answer. Harriet waited tensely, staring at the carpet for breakfast. She'd certainly come and gone in a hurry, and listening to her mother's footfalls skimming up the steps, and was surprised to hear a hiccup gasp like her mother was choking or crying. Harriet, brow wrinkled, hands on hips, stood where she was, listening. When she heard nothing, she went over cautiously and peeked into the hallway, just in time to hear the door of her mother's room open, then shut. Ages seemed to pass. Harriet eyed the corner of the encyclopedia, the outline of which protruded ever so slightly beneath the skirt of Ida's armchair. Presently, as the hall clock ticked on and still nothing stirred, she stooped and tugged the encyclopedia out from its hiding place, and lying on her stomach, chin propped in her hands, she read the firearms article from beginning to end again. One by one, the minutes threaded by. Harriet stretched out flat on the floor and lifted the tweed skirt of the chair and peered at the dark shape of the gun. At the pasteboard box of bullets lying quietly alongside it, and heartened by the silence, she reached under the chair and slid them out. So absorbed was she that she did not hear her mother coming down the stairs until suddenly she said from the hallway, very close, "Sweetie?" Harriet jumped. Some of the bullets had rolled out of the box. Harriet grabbed them up, fumbling, and stuck them by the handful into her pockets. "Where are you?" Harriet had barely enough time to scrape everything under the chair again and stand up before her mother appeared in the doorway. Her powder had worn off. Her nose was red, her eyes moist with some surprise. Harriet saw that she was carrying Robin's little blackbird costume. How black it looked, how small, dangling limp and bedraggled from its padded satin hanger like Peter Pan's shadow that he'd tried to stick on with soap. Her mother seemed about to say something, but she had stopped herself and was looking at Harriet curiously. "What are you doing?" she said. In apprehension, Harriet stared at the tiny costume. "Why?" she said, and unable to finish, she nodded at it. Harriet's mother glanced at the costume, startled, almost as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. "Oh," she said, and dabbed at the corner of her eye with the tissue. Tom French asked Edie if his child could borrow it. The first ball game is with a team called the Ravens or something, and Tom's wife thought it would be cute if one of the children dressed up like a bird and ran out with the cheerleaders. If you don't want to lend it to them, you should tell them they can't have it." Harriet's mother looked a bit surprised. For a long, strange moment, the two of them looked at each other. Harriet's mother cleared her throat. "What day do you want to drive to Memphis and buy your school clothes?" she said. "Who's going to fix them?" "Beg pardon?" "Ida always hems my school clothes." Harriet's mother started to say something, then shook her head as if to clear it of an unpleasant thought. "When are you going to get over this?" Harriet glared at the carpet. Never, she thought. "Sweetheart, I know you loved Ida, and maybe I didn't know how much." Silence, but, "Honey, Ida wanted to leave. She'd have stayed if you asked her." Harriet's mother cleared her throat. "Honey, I feel as bad about it as you do, but Ida didn't want to stay. Your father was constantly complaining about her, how little work she did. He and I fought about this all the time over the phone. Did you know that?" She looked up at the ceiling. "He thought she didn't do enough, that for what we paid her. You didn't pay her anything. Harriet, I don't think Ida had been happy here for a long time. She'll get a better salary somewhere else. It's not like I need her anymore, like when you and Allison were little." Harriet listened icily. "Ida was with us for so many years that I guess I sort of talked myself into thinking I couldn't do without her, but we've been fine, haven't we?" Harriet bit her upper lip, stared obstinately into the corner of the room. Mess everywhere, the corner table littered with pens, envelopes, coasters, old handkerchiefs, an overflowing ashtray atop a stack of magazines. "Haven't we been fine, Ida?" Her mother looked around helplessly. "Ida just rode roughshod over me. Didn't you see that?" There was a long silence, during which, out of the corner of her eye, Harriet saw a bullet she'd missed lying on the carpet under the table. "Don't get me wrong, when you girls were little, I couldn't have done without Ida. She helped me enormously, especially with," Harriet's mother sighed, "but for the last few years she hasn't been pleased with anything that went on around here. I guess she was fine with you all, but with me she was so resentful, just standing there with her arms folded and judging me." Harriet stared fixedly at the bullet. A little bored now, listening to her mother's voice without really hearing it, she kept her eyes on the floor and soon drifted away into a favorite daydream. The time machine was leaving. She was carrying emergency supplies to Scott's party at the pole. Everything depended on her. Packing list, and he'd brought all the wrong things. Must fight it out to the last biscuit. She would save them all with stores brought from the future, instant cocoa and vitamin C tablets, canned heat, peanut butter, gasoline for the sledges, and fresh vegetables from the garden, and battery-powered flashlights. Suddenly, the different position of her mother's voice got her attention. Harriet looked up. Her mother was standing in the doorway now. "I guess I can't do anything right, can I?" she said. She turned and left the room. It was not yet 10 o'clock. The living room was still shady and cool. Beyond the depressing depths of the hallway, a faint, fruity trace of her mother's perfume still hung in the dusty air. Hangers jingled and rasped in the coat closet. Harriet stood where she was, and when, after several minutes, she heard her mother still scratching around out in the hall, she edged over to where the stray bullet lay and kicked it under the sofa. She sat down on the edge of Ida's chair. She waited. Finally, after a long time, she ventured out into the hall and found her mother standing in the open door of the closet, refolding not very neatly some linens that she'd pulled down from the top shelf. As if nothing at all had happened, her mother smiled. With a comical little sigh, she stepped back from the mess and said, "My goodness, sometimes I think we should just pack up the car and move in with your father." She cut her eyes over at Harriet. She said brightly, as if she'd suggested some great treat. What would you think about that? She'll do what she wants, Harriet thought hopelessly. It doesn't matter what I say. I don't know about you, said her mother, returning to her linens, but I think it's time for us to start acting more like a family. Why, said Harriet, after a confused pause. Her mother's choice of words was alarming. Often, when Harriet's father was about to issue some unreasonable order, he preceded it with the observation, "We need to start acting more like a family here." Well, it's just too much, her mother said dreamily. Raising two girls on my own. Harriet went upstairs and sat on her window seat and looked out her bedroom window. The streets were hot and empty. All day long the clouds passed by. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she walked over to Edie's house and sat on the front steps with her chin in her hands until Edie's car rolled around the corner at 5 o'clock. Harriet ran to meet her. Edie rapped on the window and smiled. Her navy suit was a little less sharp now, rumpled from the heat, and as she climbed out of the car, her movements were creaky and slow. Harriet galloped along the walk beside her, up the steps, and onto the porch, breathlessly explaining that her mother had proposed moving to Nashville, and was shocked when Edie only breathed deeply and shook her head. Well, she said, maybe that's not such a bad idea. Harriet waited. If your mother wants to be married, she's going to have to make a little effort, I'm afraid. Edie stood still a moment, sighed, then turned the key in the door. Things can't continue like this. But why? Wailed Harriet. Edie stopped, closed her eyes as if her head hurt. He's your father, Harriet. But I don't like him. I don't care for him either, snapped Edie. But if they're going to stay married, I reckon they should live in the same state, don't you? Dad doesn't care, said Harriet after an appalled little pause. He likes things just the way they are. Edie sniffed. Yes, I suppose he does. Won't you miss me if we move? Sometimes life doesn't turn out the way we think it ought to, Edie said, as if relating some cheery but little-known fact. When school starts... Where? Thought Harriet. Here or Tennessee? You should throw yourself into your studies. That'll take your mind off things. Soon she'll be dead, thought Harriet, staring at Edie's hands, which were swollen at the knuckles and speckled with chocolate brown spots like a bird's egg. Libby's hands, though similar in shape, had been whiter and more slender, with the veins showing blue on the back. She glanced up from her reverie and was a bit shocked at Edie's cold, speculative eyes observing her closely. You ought not to have quit your piano lessons, she said. That was Allison. Harriet was always horribly taken aback when Edie made mistakes like this. I never took piano. Well, you ought to start. You don't have enough to do. That's your problem, Harriet. When I was your age, said Edie, I rode and played violin and made all of my own clothes. If you learned how to sew, you might start taking a little more interest in your appearance. Will you take me out to see Tribulation? Harriet said suddenly. Edie looked startled. There's nothing to see. But will you take me to the place, please, where it was? Edie didn't answer. She was gazing over Harriet's shoulder with a rather blank look on her face. At the roar of a car accelerating in the street, Harriet glanced over her shoulder just in time to see a metallic flash vanish around the corner. Wrong house, said Edie, and sneezed "Ka-choo." Thank goodness, no, she said, blinking, fishing in her pocketbook for a tissue. There's not much to see out at Tribulation anymore. The fellow that owns the land now is a chicken farmer, and he may not even let us up to look at the place where the house was. Why not? Because he's a fat old rascal. Everything out there's gone to pieces. She patted Harriet on the back distractedly. Now run along home and let Edie get out of these high heels. If they move to Nashville, can I stay here and live with you? Why, Harriet? Said Edie after a shocked little pause. Don't you want to be with your mother and Allison? No, ma'am, Harriet added, observing Edie closely. But Edie only raised her eyebrows as if amused. In her infuriating, chipper way, she said, Oh, I expect you'd change your mind about that after a week or two. Tears rose to Harriet's eyes. No, she cried, after a sullen, unsatisfying pause. Why do you always say that? I know what I want. I never change my. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, shall we? Said Edie. Just the other day I read something Thomas Jefferson wrote to John Adams when he was an old man, that most of the things he'd worried about in his life never came to pass. How much pain have cost us the evils that never happened? Or something of the sort. She glanced at her wristwatch. If it's any comfort, I think it'll take a torpedo to get your mother out of that house. But that's my opinion. Now run along, she said to Harriet, who stood staring at her balefully with red eyes. Maybe she's the Nain Rouge. As soon as he swung around the corner, Danny pulled over in front of the Presbyterian church. God almighty, said Farish. He was breathing hard through the nostrils. Was that her? Danny, too high and overcome to speak, nodded his head. He could hear all kinds of small, frightening noises. Trees breathing, wires singing, grass crackling as it grew. Ferris turned in his seat to look out the back window. Damn it, I told you to look for that kid. You're telling me this is the first time you've seen her? Yes, said Danny sharply. He was shaken by how suddenly the girl had jumped into view. At the uncomfortable tail end of his sight, just like she'd done at the water tower, though he couldn't tell Farish about the water tower. He wasn't supposed to be at the water tower. And now on this roundabout circuit going nowhere. Vary your route, said Farish. Vary your travel times. Keep checking your mirrors. He'd turned the corner and seen who but the girl, standing on a porch. All kinds of echoes, breathing, shining, stirring. 1,000 mirrors glinted out of the treetops. Who was the old lady? As the car slowed, she'd met Danny's gaze, had met it dead on for a confused and curious flash, and her eyes were exactly the same as the girl's. For a heartbeat, everything had dropped away. Go, Farish had said, slapping the dash, and then when they were around the corner, Danny had to pull the car over because he felt way too high, because something weird was going on, some whacking, multi-level speed telepathy, escalators going up and up, disco balls revolving on every floor. They both sensed it. They didn't even have to say a word. And Danny could hardly even look at Farish because he knew they were both remembering the same exact damn freaky thing that happened about 6 o'clock that morning. How after being up all night, Farish had walked into the living room in undershorts with a carton of milk, and at the same time a bearded cartoon character in undershorts holding a carton of milk had strode out across the television set. Farish stopped. The character stopped. Are you seeing this? Said Farish. Yes, said Danny. He was sweating. His eyes met Farish's for an instant. When they looked back at the television, the picture had changed to something else. Together, they sat in the hot car, their hearts pounding almost audibly. Did you notice, said Farish suddenly, how every single truck we seen on the way here was black? What? They're moving some. Damn if I know what. Danny said nothing. Part of him knew it was bullshit, Farish's paranoid talk, but another part knew that it meant something. 3 times the previous night, an hour apart exactly, the phone had rung, and someone had hung up without talking. Then there was the spent rifle shell Farish had found on the windowsill of the laboratory. What was that about? And now this, the girl again, the girl. The lush, sprinkled lawn of the Presbyterian church glowed blue-green in the shadows of the ornamental spruce. Curvy brick walls, clipped boxwoods, and everything as neat and twinkly as a toy train set. Hey, toy train set as the train outside's honking. What I can't figure out is who the hell she is, said Farish, scrabbling in his pocket for the crank. You shouldn't have let her get away. It was Eugene let her go, not me. Danny gnawed on the inside of his mouth. No, it wasn't his imagination. The girl had vanished off the face of the earth in the weeks after Gum's accident, when he'd driven the town looking for her. But now, think of her, mention her, and there she was, glowing at a distance with that black Chinese haircut and those spiteful eyes. They each had a toot, which steadied them somewhat. Somebody, said Danny and inhaled. Somebody has put that kid out to spy on us. High as he was sorry the instant he'd said it. Ferris's brow darkened. Say what? If somebody, he growled, scouring his wet nostrils with the back of his hand. If somebody put that little dab out to spy on me, I'll rip her wide open. She knows something, said Danny. Why? Because she'd looked at him from the window of a hearse. Because she'd invaded his dreams. Because she was haunting him, hunting him, messing with his head. Well, I'd sure like to know what she was doing up at Eugene's. If that little bitch busted out my taillights, his melodramatic manner made Danny suspicious. If she busted the taillights, he said, carefully avoiding Ferris's eye, why, you reckon she knocked on the door and told us about it? Ferris shrugged. He was picking at a crusty patch on his pants leg, had all at once got very preoccupied with it, and Danny suddenly was convinced that he knew more about the girl and about all of it than he was saying. No, it didn't make sense, but all the same, there was something to it. Dogs barked in the distance. Somebody, said Ferris, suddenly shifting his weight. Somebody clumb up there and turned them snakes loose at Eugene's. The windows is painted shut except for the one in the bathroom. Nobody could have got through that but a kid. I'm on talk to her, said Danny. Ask her lots of things, like why I never saw you in my life before, and now I see you everywhere. Like why do you brush and flitter against my windows at night like a death's head moth? He'd been so long without sleep that when he closed his eyes, he was in a place with weeds and dark lakes, wrecked skiffs of wash and scummy water. There she was, with her moth-white face and her crow-black hair, whispering something in the moist cicada shrieking gloom, something he almost understood but couldn't quite. I can't hear you, he said. Can't hear what? Bang! Black dashboard, blue Presbyterian spruces, Ferris staring from the passenger seat. Can't hear what, he repeated. Danny blinked, wiped his forehead. Forget it, he said. He was sweating. Them little sapper girls was tough sons of bitches, said Ferris cheerfully, running with live grenades. It was all a game to them. You can get a kid to do shit. Wouldn't nobody but a crazy man try. Right, Danny said. This was one of Ferris's pet theories. During Danny's childhood, he had used it to justify getting Danny and Eugene and Mike and Ricky Lee to do all his dirty work for him, climbing in windows while he, Ferris, sat eating honey buns and getting high in the car. Kid gets caught, so what? Juvenile hall? Hell, Ferris said. When y'all was boys, I had y'all trained to it. Ricky was crawling in windows soon as he could stand up on my shoulders. And if a cop come by, God almighty, said Danny soberly and sat up, for in the rearview mirror, he'd just seen the girl, alone, walk around the corner. It'd be a good time to stop reading. See if it's short enough. No, it's many pages. We can keep going here, buddy. Give me a hell yeah. Give me a hell yeah, somebody. I think I'm going to stop. What time is it? 1:37? 1:37. Guess I could go to page 458. Let's do it. Harriet, head down, brow clouded with thought, was walking down the sidewalk towards the Presbyterian church, and 3 streets over her desolate home when the door of a car parked about 20 feet ahead of her suddenly clicked open. It was the Trans Am. Almost before she had time to think, she doubled back, darted into the dank, mossy yard of the Presbyterian church, and kept running. The side yard of the church led through to Mrs. Claiborne's garden, hydrangea bushes, tiny greenhouse, directly to Edie's backyard, which was cut off by a board fence 6 feet high. Harriet ran through the dark passageway, Edie's fence on one side, a prickly, impenetrable row of arbor vitae bordering the yard adjacent, and ran smack into another fence. Mrs. Davenport's chain link. In a panic, Harriet scrambled over it. A wire on top caught her shorts and with a twist of her whole body, she wrenched free and hopped down, panting. Behind, in the leafy passage, the burst and craft of footsteps. There was not much cover in Mrs. Davenport's yard, and she looked about helplessly before she ran across it and unlatched the gate and ran down the driveway. She'd intended to double back to Edie's house, but when she got out of the sidewalk, something stopped her. Where were those footsteps coming from? And then after a split-second pause of deliberation, she ran straight ahead towards the O'Brien's house. To her shock, she was in the middle of the street. The Trans Am swung around the corner. So they'd split up. That was smart. Harriet ran under the tall pines, through the pine needles that carpeted the O'Brien's deeply shaded front yard. Directly to the little house out back where Mr. O'Brien kept his pool table. She seized the handle, shook it, locked. Harriet, breathless, stared in at the yellowy pine-paneled walls, at bookshelves, empty except for a few old yearbooks from Alexandria Academy, at the glass lamp that said Coca-Cola dangling from a chain over the dark table, and then darted off to the right. No good. Another fence. The dog in the next yard was barking. If she stayed off the street, the guy in the Trans Am obviously couldn't catch her. But she had to take care that the one on foot didn't corner her or flush her out into the open. Heart galloping, lungs aching, she swerved to the left. Behind, she heard heavy breaths, the crash of heavy feet. On she zigzagged through labyrinths of shrubbery, crossing and recrossing and veering off at right angles when her path closed off in front of her. Through strange gardens, over fences, and into a perplexity of lawns checkered with patios and flagstones, past swing sets and clothes poles, posts and barbecue grills, past a round-eyed baby who gazed at her fearfully and sat down hard in his playpen. Further down, an ugly old man with a bulldog face hoisted himself halfway from his sports chair and bawled, "Get away!" when Harriet, in relief, for he was the first grown-up she'd seen, slowed to catch her breath. His words were like a slap. As frightened as she was, the shock of them stopped her for a heartbeat, and she blinked in astonishment at the inflamed eyes blazing away at her, at the freckled, puffy old fist raised as if to strike. "That's right, you," he cried. "Get away from here." Harriet ran, though she'd heard the names of some of the people on the street, the Wrights, the Motleys, Mr. and Mrs. Price. She didn't know them except by sight. Not well enough to run up breathless and pound on their doors. Why had she let herself be chased here into unfamiliar territory? Think, she told herself. A few houses back, just before the old man shook his fist at her, she'd passed an El Camino with paint cans and plastic drop cloths in the bed. It would have been the perfect place to hide. She ducked behind a propane tank and bent double, hands on knees, gulped for breath. Had she lost them? No, a renewed fracas of barking from the penned Airedale down at the end of the block, who'd thrown himself against his fence when she ran past. Blindly she turned and plunged on. She crashed through a gap in a privet hedge and nearly fell flat across an astonished Chester, who was on his knees, fooling with a soaker hose in a thickly mulched flower bed. He threw up his arms as if at an explosion. "Watch out!" Chester did odd jobs for all sorts of people, but she didn't know he worked over here. "What in thunder? Where can I hide?" "Hide? This ain't no place for you to play." He swallowed, flung a muddy hand at her. "Go on, scat." Harriet, panic-stricken, glanced around. Glass hummingbird feeder, glassed-in porch, pristine picnic table. The opposite side of the yard was walled in with a thicket of holly. In the back, a bank of rose bushes cut off her retreat. "Scat," I said, "look at this hole you done knocked in the hedge." A flagstone path lined with marigolds led to a persnickety dollhouse of a tool shed, painted to match the house. Gingerbread trim, green doors standing ajar. In desperation, Harriet dashed down the walk and ran inside. "Hey!" called Chester, and threw herself down between a stack of firewood and a fat roll of fiberglass insulation. The air was thick and dusty. Harriet pinched her nose shut. In the dimness, chest heaving, scalp a prickle, she stared at an old frayed badminton birdie lying on the floor by the stacked logs. at a group of colorful metal cans that said gasoline and gear oil and Prestone. Voices male, Harriet stiffened. A long time passed, during which it seemed that the cans that said gasoline and gear oil and Prestone were the last three article, or what? Prestone worthy the last, I don't know what the hell that is. The last three artifacts in the universe. What can they do to me? She thought wildly in front of Chester. Though she strained to listen, the rasp of her breath deafened her. Just scream, she told herself. If they grab you, scream and break free. Scream and run. For some reason, the car was what she feared most. Though she could not say why, she had a sense that if they got her in the car, it was all over. She didn't think Chester would let them take her, but there were two of them, and only one of Chester, and Chester's word probably wouldn't go very far against two white men. Moments ticked by. What were they saying? What was taking so long? Intently, Harriet stared at a dried-up honeycomb underneath the workbench. Then suddenly, she sensed the form approaching. The door creaked open. A triangle of washed-out light fell across the dirt floor. All the blood rushed from Harriet's head, and for a moment she thought she was going to black out. But it was only Chester saying, "Come on out now." It was as if a glass barrier had shattered. Noises came washing back, birds twittering, a cricket chirping stridently on the floor behind an oil can. "You in there?" Harriet swallowed. Her voice when she spoke was faint and scratchy. "Are they gone? What did you do to them men?" The light was behind him. She couldn't see his face, but it was Chester, all right. Chester's sandpapery voice, his loose jointed silhouette. "They act like you picked their pocket." "Are they gone?" "Yes, they gone," said Chester impatiently. "Get on from out of there." Harriet stood up behind the roll of insulation and smeared her forehead with the back of her arm. She was peppered all over with grit, and cobwebs were stuck to the side of her face. "You ain't knock anything over in there, did you?" said Chester, peering back into the recesses of the shed, and then down at her. "Ain't you a sight?" He opened the door for her. "Why they get after you?" Harriet, still breathless, shook her head. "Men like that got no business running after some child," said Chester, glancing over his shoulder as he reached in his breast pocket for a cigarette. "What'd you do? You threw a rock at their car?" Harriet craned her neck to see around him. Through the dense shrubbery, privet, holly, she had no view at all of the street. "Tell you what," Chester exhaled sharply through his nostrils. "You're lucky I was working over here today. Mrs. Mulverhill, she not at her choir practice. She called the police on you for busting through here. Last week she make me turn the hose on some poor old dog wander up in the yard." He smoked his cigarette. Harriet's heart still pounded in her ears. "What you doing anyway?" said Chester, tearing around in people's bushes. "I ought to tell your grandmother. What'd they say to you?" "Say? They ain't say nothing. One of them got his car parked out on the street there. The other one stick his head through the hedge there and peep in like he, the electrician, looking for a meter." Chester parted invisible branches and imitated the gesture, complete with weird eye roll. "Got on a coverall like Mississippi Power and Light." Overhead, a branch popped. It was only a squirrel, but Harriet started violently. "You ain't gonna tell me why you run for those men?" I was what?" "I was playing," said Harriet weakly. "You ought not to get yourself so worked up." Through a haze of smoke, Chester observed her shrewdly. "What you looking at so fearful over that away? You want me to walk you over to your house?" "No," said Harriet. But as she said it, Chester laughed, and she realized that her head was nodding yes. Chester put a hand on her shoulder. "You all mixed up," he said, but despite his cheerful tone, he had a worried look. "Tell you what, I was going home by your house. Give me a minute to wash off under the hydrant, and I'll walk you on down." Walk you on down. Hell yeah. That's going to be the all for that. What was that? 459? 458. All right, Bobs, that's all. It's almost an hour, 54 minutes and 30 some seconds.